to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So the first thing, before I talk about how we're going to conduct this conversation, the first thing I'm going to do is to ask the Prof to tell us why he wrote this book and why he thought his thoughts, which I have valued and treasured over the last 20 years. I never used to know him. And then I met somebody called Mzugisi, who said, oh, Mills is my friend. When he mentions him in the book, and I was like, oh, okay, finally I meet somebody who knows this Mills Soko that I read in the newspapers. And that was even before I was in the newspapers. So I have read, he was gracious enough to send me the manuscript and I went through it. And often when we read books, we lose the sense of the time and the color of the times in which we have just lived through. And his reflections on the last 20 years are definitely really, really interesting. So I'm going to ask him to make a few opening remarks so that he can give us a sense of what prompted him to share with us the thoughts that he's had and observations he's had over the last 20 years. And then we'll get into conversation. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Songezo, for agreeing to be our chair this afternoon. I really appreciate your making time to help us launch this book. And I also want to thank Rutendo for that very warm welcome and all the greetings that I've received ahead of the launch of this book. You mentioned Songezo, you mentioned Mzugisi Kobo, who is a very good friend and colleague of mine. He was actually the reason I wrote the book. The idea of writing the book came about during a conversation that I had with him in 2019. I had met Mzugisi for the first time while I was doing the first year of my doctoral studies at the University of Warwick. And I had gone to the Department of Trade and Industry to do some interviews for my thesis, which focused on the political economy of trade reform. And Mzugisi was introduced to me by a friend, and we hit it off immediately. And we had lunch, and he told me about his ambitions, his dreams. And he subsequently, by the way, also completed his studies, his doctorate at the University of Warwick. But during this conversation in 2019, Mzugisi felt that he had read so much of my work over the years, and that he had been inspired by it. He thought that I should share it widely, that there would be a great deal of interest in my work, especially given that this is not just focused on South Africa, but it's also focused on the global economy and how South Africa is situated within that global economy. So it was this book is the outcome of that conversation. It is made up of 8 chapters, which cover a whole range of topics: foreign policy, business ethics, leadership, politics, international trade, which is my forte, global governance, and foreign policy. And it's arranged thematically. And what I seek to do here in this book is to analyze South Africa's political economy currently, and also South Africa's position in the global economy over the last 20 years. So one thing I want to make very clear is that this book is not a parochial focus, doesn't have a parochial focus on South Africa. And it's not about focusing on South Africa's problems. It's about focusing on South Africa's position in the global economy using the lens of South African political economy. So I thought that is something I wanted to highlight here because it's very, very important. In some ways, this book represents, my political economy journey, which started at the University of Cape Town in the 1980s when I was a student activist, through parliament, through university, and also through academia. So it reflects, it's an attempt to chronicle my political economic journey. And this period, which these pieces in the book document, was a very important period. It was a defining period, the last 20 years, which saw a lot of very defining moments and defining events, including Brexit, lately including the launch, the invention of the iPad, and many other events. So it's a really important historical period. So I thought that I would document this period in a systematic and a very coherent way, hopefully to just demonstrate the journey that South Africa and the world have traveled over the last 20 years. This is not, it's a book which it raises a lot of things about what has not worked in terms of politics, foreign policy, and other thematic areas that are covered in the book, but it also does provide views on how some of the problems that have constrained South Africa and the world can be solved. So this is not about just complaining, it's about highlighting in a very sharp way the challenges that the world and South Africa face over the last 20 years in particular, but also providing some ideas on how those problems can be resolved. Now, the fundamental central theme in all the chapters, which I've tried to communicate, is that leadership and governance matter. Leadership and governance matter. Whether in the national context or in the international context, because poor governance is not only a local problem, it's a worldwide problem, it's an international problem. As we'll speak about the role of politics in framing everything that we do, in terms of how it can change society, in terms of how it can generate national prosperity. So this is the constant central theme that pervades this book. Those are the remarks I wanted to make, opening remarks I wanted to make, Songezo, and we can now launch into our conversation.
Prof, thank you very much. I didn't know that Prof Kobo is a colleague of yours at Wits. Had a lot to do with it, but I guess I should have known, by the way, because as you know, he's always he's a challenging character in the sense that he's always pushing the people around him to do better, to produce a better version of themselves. So thank you very much for writing this book. So the first question I'm going to ask you, because I underlined it when I first got the manuscript, is that you, in your introduction to chapter 1, and the essay that's in there is you wrote it a few days after the former President Zuma fired the then Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene for reasons that have now since become apparent, but he doesn't want to answer to. And you said South Africa desperately needs good politicians. The country has suffered the dreadful consequences of being led by bad politicians. You wrote this before Donald Trump. I want to challenge you and say the world is in desperate need of good politicians. What is a good politician? Because I think we know what a bad politician is. We know from other countries, but what is a good politician and why is that so important?
Thank you. So I think the important point you raise is that the world needs good politicians, not only South Africa. That's very, very important to me. And Donald Trump is a very good example of a bad politician for reasons that are evident to everyone. There are other leaders also, such as Viktor Orban, who's the Prime Minister of Hungary. We've also seen other leaders like Matteo Salvini in Italy. We have a big problem of a leader in Brazil. Currently, Brazil is under a complete meltdown, social, economic, and public health meltdown because of very, very bad leadership under the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro. So I had to make that point very clear. To me, a good politician, politics frames everything we do. It can be a force for good, it can be a force for for ill. So a good politician for me is somebody who's truly and genuinely committed to public service and to the public good. Somebody who's ethical, who does not use public office for personal gain, whether economic or otherwise. They've got to be hardworking, like everyone. They've got to have not only the ability to formulate policies, but also execution capabilities. And this is a big challenge that faces many countries, that have politicians and public officials with very limited execution capabilities. So the lessons we can learn there from countries like Singapore and China, which have demonstrated that politicians can actually execute policies. And also, I think it's going to be someone who has a very good command of public policy. And lastly, somebody who uses politics as a force for change and for progress. That is what, for me constitutes a good politician.
Now, Prof, you've said a lot about leadership. First, let me talk to the audience and say the Prof and I are not going to engage in reading large excerpts of the book. We're going to go through it thematically. The important thing is that you must get the book. It's really, really an important volume of work that I think as many South Africans and other citizens of the continent and the world ought to read. So we're going to talk about the themes therein and go on an odyssey between the past and the present, and eventually we're going to talk about the future as well. Prof, you've spoken about leadership, and I think you've said quite a bit about what constitutes not just a good politician, but solid political leadership. But I also look at the corporate sector as well, because while politicians are exceptionally powerful, they don't control all levers of power in a society. In democratic societies, the two really powerful interests are society as well as business, in particular large businesses. And I'd like to ask you to reflect on how you feel the leadership in business, globally first and then in South Africa, is rising to the challenges of our time of constructing societies that are prosperous, that are inclusive, and so on, because I sometimes wonder how, for instance, US corporations are comfortable with paying little or no tax, because they're able to game the system and influence politics so much that they end up paying very little tax relative to you and I, or people who are in mine and your position, who are ordinary people with sort of in the middle and working in the working classes. So what are your insights in terms of how you believe the business class is shaping up to the challenges of leadership at this time?
Very important question. And I agree with you that the issue of leadership is not confined to politicians, public officials, but it also straddles other sectors of society. And you mentioned business. I've been very concerned about the quality of business leadership in this country and also in the world. There are very good business leaders, visionary business leaders, but we've also seen over the years that that the quality of leadership has declined, largely because of the ethical lapses that have occurred. We've seen extensive information about revelations about ethical lapses in the so-called Panama Papers, which involves international companies, also multinational companies that foment corruption in the developing world, including South Africa. We've also seen how these business leaders have not really lived up to expectations in society. And a lot of reports, for instance, the Pew survey report, it shows that multinational corporations are amongst the most unpopular societal actors in the world because of the perception that people have about multinational corporations, that they exploit workers, that, they're all concerned about profit, not about development. So I agree with you on that. And I think that in the context of the US, both COVID and also the issues of racial injustice have really cast a very strong spotlight on the business sector, especially the death of George Floyd, who was murdered in the United States. And that really raised a big debate about issues of social inequality, about racial inequality and all those issues, which forced some business leaders to even take a stance, that they're going to act to deal with issues of diversity, issues of inequality and all that. And there's also been a great deal of pressure in the US, Songezo, in the context of the ascendancy of the Biden administration, who has really taken a very tough stance against the business sector. He's really moved away from the philosophy, the traditional economic philosophy that has defined American administrations in the past, the laissez-faire neoliberal economic policies. He's talking about the need for radical change, the issues about taxation, how he's confronted corporations on tax, that they are not doing enough to pay tax, they are ripping off the ordinary public. He's also spoken about the need for business to contribute towards national development in the US, infrastructure and all those things. So I fully agree with you on that. I also want to make a point that in all fairness, we have seen a strong movement emerging in global business, of what is called purpose-driven businesses. A huge debate that has emerged. A lot has been written about that. There's a book by Colin Meyer from Oxford Said Business School has written about that, where businesses are beginning to realize that, they can't just put profit before purpose. Those work together. That businesses can make money, they can be profitable while solving social problems. Problems like inequality, problems like the environmental climate crisis, and a host of other problems. So we are seeing a shift, especially amongst leaders, that what I've noticed in Europe and the United Kingdom, in terms of thinking about the role of business in society. And that, to a large extent, has been triggered by the events we've seen, the traumatic events that we've seen, COVID, which has really redefined the way business is seen largely, but also the issues about climate change, social inequality, and so on and so on.
Now, Prof, would you say that we had an opportunity, especially during the first term of democracy, 1996 to 1994 to 1999, and perhaps to 2001, 2002, right? Where it appears that, and this is my opinion, that had the ANC not been in the bush and in a relationship with Russia, with the Soviet Union and so on, it might have been more as Mandela and others might have been more astute in fashioning a more incisive and inclusive social contract with business, because certainly there was a lot of warm, fuzzy, positive sentiment about the fact that we'd averted actual disaster with the miracle of 1994 and had a super sort of liberal constitution, not liberal in the pejorative sense that people use it, in the sense that it really guarantees and entrenches individual and collective freedoms in the society. What are your thoughts when you reflect on that period? Do you think we missed any opportunities? Because I certainly think we did to an extent.
I think we did, and a large part of these Songezo, which continues to be a problem, is that there is a great deal of mistrust between business and the government in South Africa. So a government which is a predominantly black government, and the business sector which is predominantly white, which controls the economy. I think that this is a big constraint on how business and government work, in this country. And I've had many conversations personally with several business leaders who some are very keen to contribute to the country, but there's very little happening in terms of a meaningful dialogue between them and the government. So the technical language to communicate the priorities of this country and to define what needs to be done, that does not exist. So this is a very big challenge in this country. I also think that at the same time, there's an opportunity. What COVID has done, COVID has been a big disruptor, but it has also created enormous, extraordinary opportunities for us, to fashion a kind of transformative consensus on the economy.
Yeah.
There are things that can be done, which other governments are doing in the United States, in Asia. They've used the opportunity created by COVID to drive social change and economic change, digital transformation, to reform the public health systems, to reform the education systems. And I think we have that opportunity. We must not miss out on that opportunity as South Africa, because we can use COVID to reform state-owned enterprises. We can use it to address log jams in the economy. We can use this to ease make it possible for small businesses to operate effectively. We can use it to do a lot of other things, including driving economic transformation, by the way. But to go back to the theme that dominates this book is that, do we have the leadership and the governance to do so, right? So we have the resources, we have a country with enormous potential, and here is an opportunity to do this. But the question is, do we have the leadership to do so? Now, when you look at the global context, Songezo, there's never been a more opportune time, because a lot of countries have now moved away from the restrictive economic, nostrums of the 1990s and early 2000s. Those countries that believed in fiscal austerity and reducing fiscal deficits, all those things, they become more expansive in the outlook, because they argue the current situation we find ourselves in, it's a very unusual situation, the crisis that we find ourselves in. So it requires unusual solutions. We need to be bold. We need to be progressive. So even the United States, which has traditionally pursued these conservative economic policies, it has surprised us. The Biden administration, echoing the years of the Great Depression under Franklin Roosevelt, adopting expansive policies, to focus on infrastructure, to focus on education, to spend money, So they have the leadership, in my view, to do so. But the question is, do we have that leadership? So there are not global constraints in which you're operating currently in terms of economic thinking and economic philosophy. We can fashion our own way in this country, the way we implement our economic policies to address the many social and economic challenges that we face. But do we have the leadership to do that? That is the question.
Prof, one of the things I like about what you do, and it's with some of your essays, right, is that you weave between the leadership theme and also systematic thinking about how you drive change in the long term, and why that matters in relation to times when you need to make very big and significant shifts. And I will juxtapose what you've just said about the Biden administration and expansive monetary policy and public spending and so on in order to stimulate economic growth and get people back to work so that you can start generating the tax revenues and the economic activity that drives growth, not just in the US, but in the rest of the world. And we're going to talk about this later on, by the way, because I do have sort of issues to raise. But in July 2015, you wrote a piece where you said, who's next? Who, for those who can't see this, is President Hu Jintao of China. And the subtitle was What China Could Teach the ANC about Succession. So I'm going to tell a little story. So I have a book here that somebody bought for me. I can't see it now. My eye always goes to it because I keep it close. And it's called Prisoner of the State. It's written by Zhao Ziyang. Zhao Ziyang was the Chinese premier during Tiananmen Square. His aide, so he went to speak to the students one night on Tiananmen Square. He was holding a sort of a bullhorn, a loudspeaker such as we have it, the one Andile Lungisa was using to go around PE to say he's sorry. And somebody was holding this loudspeaker for him. And I'm not going to ask you to guess, but I'll tell you who it was. It was Wen Jiabao. Wen Jiabao was his aide at the time. He was his chief of staff at the time. And of course, you know, Wen Jiabao later became a Chinese premier, right? And so I've always been fascinated by China and succession and the conscious decision they took, I think, to skip a generation, as it were, which is how the Hu Jintaos and others came into power. You also talk about the fact that the Chinese leaders have been engineers, almost to a man, right? Or some other qualification which is modern, which is critical to national and human development. And the subtext in that, and this is not something that you wrote specifically, but the subtext I picked from that is that knowledge and experience are critical to exercising the right political judgment. Because China has not grown to this extent and so fast and so sustainably over a long time through ideological orientation alone, right? And the intellectual clarity of where they wanted to go. I mean, it's not a perfect setting, but it is. But that's one of the things I extract from your book. But I want to pose a challenge to you to the political economy question, which is, we also live in liberal democracies. The Chinese can do that, right? They're a one-party state. They can make a decision, and they've recently had a decision for a lifelong president, but they can make that decision. Here, and in many other countries like the United States or Britain, where you've had Brexit, or in Hungary, where you've got Viktor Orban, or in Russia, where you've got Vladimir Putin, not quite a democracy, it's a gamble every now and again about who's going to be your leader. How is this done? How do we get this right? In countries where people have got unfettered choice.
Important question. Firstly, Songezo, I want to say that, I wrote that article because I was always interested in understanding what the ANC government wants to learn from China, because there was a series of delegations.
And probably didn't.
There was a series of delegations, but not only from South Africa, but other parts of the world. Because China's story is remarkable, not least because this is a country that was a basket case, an economic basket case in the middle, 1970s, after Mao Zedong died in 1976. And within 30 years, it rose to become the second largest economy in the world. So that's an extremely remarkable story within 30 years. And that is why people take notice when one speaks about China. But I think the point I wanted to make there was that, to go back, leadership matters. The Chinese understand the importance of leadership, of experienced leadership, of knowledgeable leadership, and competent leadership, and they invest in leadership, and they groom, generations, and prepare them for critical positions in government in other parts of the political economy. So that was the purpose of this. And the Chinese themselves have also learned from other countries, notably from Singapore. A lot of what China does today, they learn from countries like Japan and from Singapore. For example, how the Chinese reformed their state-owned enterprises and they ran. They learned from Singapore. So I wrote that piece to highlight the importance of leadership and meritocracy, of the importance of execution capabilities. In China, leaders don't rise to the top unless they have proven experience, they've proven credentials. So those who rise to the very top, they're the top of the top within the leadership establishment. So that is the point I wanted to highlight. Whether this has to do with I think it's a red herring, this whole notion of a one-party state. We know that China is a one-party state, and we are a democracy. We're a vibrant democracy, and there's a lot that I personally have visited China many times. There are certain things I don't like, for instance, not having access to Twitter and Facebook and all that. But I think that there are certain things that we can learn, right? The way the Chinese themselves do, because they're pragmatic. They always want to learn from other countries. What they need and what they don't need, they discard. We can also do the same, right? There's a lot we can still learn from them, but we don't have to be a party state, one-party state. There are other countries that have developed tremendously without being party states. I remember Australia in the 1970s was in the economic doldrums, a liberal democracy. But look where Australia is. Look at where New Zealand. Those are not one-party states. They are Western liberal democracy. So we can still develop and achieve greatness without having to make ourselves a one-party state. So for me, that's a red herring.
Look, I mean, certainly I wasn't suggesting that. I was just saying those efforts are vulnerable to democratic choices, right? So, you can have something like a succession plan. The reality is that in a democracy, it might be the other party that wins with no capacity, but because they're populist, right? With zero capacity. And the people that you've spent so many years now, we know the ANC tried in a rush, and I think it kind of still worked in a way, in the early 1990s, to send as many people as possible abroad, either to the United Kingdom or to the United States, to learn how to manage an economy in the global context that we had at the time. And I think to a large degree it served us really well. But that project didn't continue. To your point, that project did not continue. We don't have the revolving door that you have in some democracies where professionals work in the public and private services at the same time. So you might leave a job now, go into the private sector and come back into the public service. We appear to have developed parallel streams where people are in the public service forever or jump into the private sector and never come back. And if they're in the private sector, they almost never go into the public service. And so you have people who regulate economies who have no understanding of what being in the real economy is like, right? And I think in a way, that is the problem the Chinese have kind of managed to get around, and the Germans and others to do quite well. Prof, I don't want to keep you long because I want us to talk about foreign policy and geopolitics, because this is important, because South Africans tend to have, okay, maybe let me not overgeneralize. Some South Africans I speak to who are part of the chartering classes tend to have a black and white view of international politics, which is you've got the West that hates us and the rest that absolutely loves us. And the Chinese will always act in our interest because we're part of the BRICS and they absolutely love us. And so will the Russians and the Brazilians. But of course, you mentioned Jair Bolsonaro earlier on. I don't think he's the kind of person we want to make our friend, right? Because his politics and his values do not even remotely represent anything that we stand for in terms of our constitution and historically as a country. So that's one aspect of to keep that in mind. The second part is whether, I've wondered, and you do crisscross this terrain in your book, about whether South Africa has had the consciousness to understand that diplomatic relations are also about commercial interests for the development of your people, which is what the Chinese do, because they will rescue the United States if it starts sinking, because they can't afford to have those guys sink, while we think they would let them sink. I'd like you to offer your thoughts about South Africa's approach to kind of international relations, global trade, and the geopolitical shifts, which have become increasingly dynamic. And you deal with this numerous times in your book. Yeah.
My view is that, and this is a central point I make, is that our foreign policy must not be based on superficial ideological impulses. It must be pragmatic, and it must be rooted in our vital national interests. That's very, very important for me. So I become concerned when some of the foreign policy thinkers and commentators make the kinds of simplistic descriptions that we have referred to. You know, this whole North-South divide. I do agree that we need to collaborate with other countries in the global South, especially those with like-minded, views as ours. But that does not mean we should neglect our relationship with our traditional established powers. And the reason I say that, when you look, for instance, at South Africa's relations with the key trade partners of South Africa, the single largest trade partner is China. And then the next key trade partners, United States, Germany, those countries, France, the UK. So those are traditional partners, are very important. And the key thing also about that is that, our export basket, right? Our export basket in those countries is very diversified. So we not only export raw materials to these countries in the same way as we do to China, because our exports to China are dominated by raw materials. But when you look at the United States, we export wines, we export nuts, we export platinum, we export cars, we export a host of things. So very diversified export basket. And we have benefited immensely from that relationship in terms of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So I would like to see our foreign policy makers looking at policy from a perspective of being, what is the vital national interest of South Africa? Not in terms of whether these people are our friends or not, because that is how Russia views the world. That is how China views the world, right? China is very, very interested in relations, different parts of the world, but which are informed by its vital national interests. If South Africa were to do something that annoyed China, or created problems for China, China will punish South Africa. There's no doubt about that.
Say it, Prof. Say, if we invited the Dalai Lama to meet.
Yeah, in the same way.
Say it, Prof. If we invited the Dalai Lama here, they wouldn't be happy, for instance. Something as superficial as that.
So, but that, for them, that is their core vital interest, foreign policy interest. It's very, very important. There's some, it's a non-negotiable. So what I would like to see is that we have to have good relations with a lot of these countries, but we need to prioritize these countries. And we must not do that on the basis of these superficial ideological impulses, but on the basis of vital interest.
Prof, in fact, for the benefit of our audience, I'm going to read, and please send questions. I see some comments on the chat. Please send questions for Prof. But Prof, you've put it beautifully, where you say that foreign policy has failed to articulate a clear policy approach that is aligned to South Africa's normative values, its developmental role, and its commercial interests. With respect to the latter, South Africa's foreign policy doctrine has lacked strategic intent, to pursue commercial opportunities in Africa. And that's my next theme that I want to discuss with you. By failing to view the country's participation in the global environment from the perspective of enhancing national prosperity, South Africa has lost out in Africa to the efficient diplomatic and commercial machinery of emerging powers such as China. So for the audience, I will offer you an experience, 2 examples. So I spoke to a former director general when I was still in business there. I spoke to a former DG of DECO who said that he was part of a delegation, as somebody in that position would be, to China. And so they all sat at the state dinner, and he sat next to a Chinese minister or senior official, I think a counterpart of his, who asked him, so why is it that your Transnet and all of these similar companies don't fall under your Department of Transport? So he asks him. And Dr. Spoon Debele was the Minister of Transport at the time, and he says he avoided the question. He said, let me go and call my colleague over there to come and answer the question. But here's the thing, Prof. He said this gentleman could tell him how long it would take them to build a high-speed train from Johannesburg to Durban and where they would tunnel in. So he understood the terrain, right? But that is the level to which they had applied themselves to South Africa's own situation, right? So again, what we see in this example is exactly what you are saying, where you've got an international conversation, a country-to-country conversation here, where there appears to be enormous opportunities. But this conversation goes further. He says, he then asks him, so how long do you think it would take us to build such a line between Durban and Johannesburg? He said, if we did it, 2 years. If you guys did it, 10 years. He says, right? Which speaks to capability, speaks to leadership, and so on. But I do want to talk about our role in the continent. You know, there was a time when we were the gateway to Africa and so on, but I've traveled around the continent a bit. Why there is a combination of admiration, disappointment, and resentment, right? Admiration in the sense that there are things in South Africa that our compatriots on the continent wish they had, and they would really love to have them, and they look up to that. Our human rights constitution and so on, human rights guarantees and so on. But then there's a resentment as well, in that we perceived to behave like a big brother and a bully, right? And of course, there is derision at how we have also squandered an enormous opportunity that we've just had. And South Africa's role on the continent is something you deal with. And I'm going to challenge you also to talk about the present, Prof, which is in this time that we are in, with the transformation of COVID, with climate change. How do you think these developments should inform our foreign policy, our trade, international trade approach, and so on, so that we can play a constructive, admirable leadership role on the continent?
Yeah, very important questions. I think that, you know, there was a time when our foreign policy was the high point of our foreign policy, especially in Africa, where we were very effective, especially during the Mbeki era. You know, Mbeki was a state builder in South Africa, but also an institution builder on the African continent. He played a very important role in the construction of the African Union, in the construction of NEPAD, and many other ambitious African initiatives. So South African foreign policy was punching above its weight. And you're right, initially there was a great deal of goodwill. You know, there was goodwill, but there was also awe, there was also fear about the growing role of South Africa in Africa. But I would say that because I also travel quite a lot on the continent, there's been a great deal of, I would say, disappointment with what is going on in South Africa internally, and also which has resulted in South Africa losing influence, the influence that it used to have in the past. And we saw that we see the debates within the African Union, But we also see that in the, the representation, underrepresentation of South Africans in these important multilateral institutions like the AU, even though South Africa is one of the major contributors to the nation, to the annual budgets of these institutions. So there's a great deal of concern about what's happening in South Africa on the continent. But another issue which I think we have not paid enough attention to is the impact of the foray of foreign powers, into the continent. Not only China, but India. Turkey is involved in a very ambitious agenda, to influence the African continent and to make to secure opportunities for trade, to also use soft power to shape public opinion. And then we have countries like Russia, which was away for a long time. It's come back now, and it's going to host a Russia-Africa summit next year. And my concern is that we have lost as a country. We still a very important trade and investment partner in Africa, but we've lost a lot of influence in terms of our ideas, but also in terms of market share, right? In terms of trade. And I'm sometimes wonder to what extent also are we able to influence what is happening within the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So I think South Africa can rejuvenate its engagements on the African continent because it's a captive market for South Africa. It's a major export destination. We have a very huge diplomatic footprint on the continent, but there are certain things we need to do to fix that, which have to do with these issues that we're referring to, about leadership, about governance, about projection of our power. And one of the things that concerns me, Songezo, is that we are the most industrialized country in Africa. But sometimes that it's not evident in the way sometimes South Africa gets kicked around by even small countries, like Zimbabwe and other countries, and I've seen this within the SACU, where South Africa gets challenged.
And SACU is the SA Customs Union.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the kinds of things that are happening in the Southern African region, you would never find them in West Africa. Nigeria would not allow that kind of thing, or Brazil in Latin America. So it concerns me that we can subject ourselves to so many, kinds of difficulties, even though we're a major power. Of course, that does not mean we should not act. We should be very respectful to our neighbors. We should be fair. We should contribute towards working together to finding solutions. But there are certain interests that we have which diverge with those of our neighbors. And some of them are they are valid interests. For instance, migration, the impact of what's going on in Zimbabwe and in South Africa, the huge influx of migrants and how this is affecting the social economic effects of this in South Africa and other effects. That should be a vital foreign policy interest of South Africa. Nobody talks about that. It should be at the core, in the same way as the United States talks about it. Whether Trump will do it his own way, Biden, but migration is a big issue in the US. And it's at the top of the foreign policy priorities of the country. So with all the problems that are happening here, concerning this, it really concerns me that there's not very little discussion, very little debate, happening in South Africa about that.
Prof, I didn't want to get you started on that because I remember some of your articles, by the way, and there was you've been writing for years about how sometimes we get kicked around, right? And I can remember several incidents, but there was also the collapse of the building in Nigeria, where the Nigerian government just adopted a whatever attitude towards the whole thing. I remember you were less than happy at South Africa's timid response to to this development. I'm mindful of time. There's something, Prof, that I'm really impressed with. I must tell you, I'm really impressed with, because some of the articles you wrote were prophetic, in the sense that 2006 was 15 years ago. And you wrote a piece called Information Age Changes Approach to Trade. Right? It sounds so trite now when we talk about it, right? But I must tell you, when I saw it again, I remembered it, and I think I remembered my reaction, which was, yeah, I sort of get it, but I think it's reaching a little bit, right? But today, you and I are able to travel overseas. South Africans are able to travel overseas, swipe their card at a speed point, and that's it. The transaction goes through. Or we buy something on Amazon and something goes through. What many South Africans do not realize is that that's international trade. That's an import. That's an import. And when an international foreign tourist enters their credit card details from Europe to pay for accommodation and buy flights on SAA and so on, that's an import. We're exporting a service. And we take these things for granted. And yet you wrote about this in 2006, Prof, before we could tap with our cards, right? Please, can you just give us further insights, because the possibilities going into the future are enormous again, right? So
Yeah.
you can offer us a few thoughts.
But Songezo, I remember I wrote about that in 2006. It remains relevant because, and this is what COVID has done. You know, COVID has accelerated digitization and digitalization, and you know, decisions that companies had thought, you know, they would delay, you know, before they embrace that route of digitalization and digitization. They've had to move fast now because COVID has forced them to do. Now, the big challenge now is, how do we regulate electronic commerce, right? Because this is moving faster, you know, fintech and all those, and yet trade rules, both global and continental trade rules, they're lagging behind, right? So the negotiations that are happening, for instance, within the African Continental Free Trade and WTO, we'll have to look at how, with this increased accelerated digitalization, how we're going to regulate this, because this is, you know, this is not like as you say, a good, you know, it's not a product, it's not an Apple, it's not, this is electronic commerce, it's services.
Yeah. Yes. And we take it for granted, right?
Yeah.
Because it's part of normal. And yet we're going into cryptocurrencies and so on. But before we close, I do want you to talk a little bit about global governance, because international rules are really important. And this topic fascinated me in the sense that it, in a way, ties a lot of these things that you've written about in the book, right? It talks to leadership, it talks to strength and effectiveness of political institutions, it talks to business ethics, it talks to political ethics, to ethics at a political level, but what this world in which we live should look like, it's how people should experience it and how we grow going forward. Climate change, inequality, global tax regimes and so on, in order to ensure a fair contribution to fiscal systems and so on. It's a really complex environment, and yet it's something that many of us hardly pay much attention to. And I'd like us to just give us a sense of how that is shaping up, and what, you know, some of the principles you think are important going forward, and that South Africans in particular need to pay attention to in this context.
Well, it's a big topic, Songezo, in global governance, and there are very, very big problems which currently plague the global system. And to go back again, if the leadership issue, the leadership and governance issue is a big issue. The current global system is based on what was created after the Second World War, what is called the liberal international order, post-war liberal international order, which was shaped by Western powers like the United States and Japan and other countries. And it reflected their priorities, their interests, right? So that is why it has been challenged, from the South, emerging powers like China challenging the underpinnings of this system. But when you look at the number of issues and challenges and the scale of problems that existed in the post-war period, post-1945, and today, as you say, there's been a dramatic change, right? The problems are multifaceted. Today, we're dealing with COVID, we're dealing with climate change, we're dealing with issues related to demographics, and a host of other issues, which require that these global institutions must be suited to address these problems. But these institutions, which were established in the post-1945 period, like the World Bank, the IMF, even the WHO, they are not equipped to deal with so many problems. They need to be reformed if they are able to do so. So this is the point I highlight as we cannot continue the way we're doing. We need to do something about global governance. But the problem is that there is a lack of, to go back, political leadership. Partly that has to do with the rise of China. China was initially seen as a potential strategic partner by Western countries, but now it's seen as a strategic competitor. A lot of countries, the US, they feel threatened by China. So they allowed China to globalize, they accepted China into the WTO, but China has now become a really ambitious and forceful and assertive, so they feel threatened by that. And that is why we had the trade war between the US, and the tensions continue to this day. And Joe Biden, the president of the United States, has identified China as the United States' single most important foreign policy challenge. So within that context, we are going to have problems because the United States retreated from multilateralism, and it's the relationship between the two countries. Well, the second largest economy and the largest economy is not good. So that, for me, has huge implications for global governance. I cannot tell you how this is going to unfold because these matters are unpredictable. But all I can say is that a great deal of how the global system is going to unfold in the coming years will be shaped by the relationship between China and the United States, for better or for worse. That is where, so the binary, that binary relationship, we're going back, these are echoes of this Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union in the past. And we're seeing that type of Cold War and tensions between China and the United States. So this is what will shape the future trajectory of the global system, in my view.
Prof, before we close, I want to do justice to Leonard Hoadi and Alex Anderson, who've taken the trouble to type some questions. And in a way, we've dealt with them at some point, but I think it's important that we maybe just close off on them properly. The first question from Leonard is with why China has been more successful than India, and whether that is not could it be that democracy is vulnerable to populist leadership? I think we spoke about that, but to the extent that you've got any thoughts. And the last question is, can you just define, in your view, what our vital national interest should be? That's what Alex Anderson wants to know. What should how should we define our vital national interest as South Africa?
Yeah. Okay, so the China-India relationship, it's a very old story. And there was a time when they were seen as both in the early 2000s, some commentators were arguing that India will overtake China, will become more developed than China. They have big economies, both of them, but China is really accelerated faster than India. And in terms of its development, in terms of its the global footprint, in terms of its institutions. So I don't think the problem is to do with the fact that India is a democracy. I'm very suspicious of that idea that because a country is a robust democracy. I'm a big fan of India's democracies. I like it. I like, the newspapers, you're a newspaper editor, the way newspapers write about leaders and all that. So I don't want to diminish the importance of India as a democracy. And I don't think that's an explanation for, I think the explanation lies elsewhere. One of the big problems that has really regressed India is corruption, weak institutions, there are issues about leadership. They've had some very good leaders, but also many bad leaders. And the manner in which India has tackled questions internally, about communal conflict, but also inequality and all those issues, they've done it differently from China. I think India is an important country, an important economy, but there are many things that really set the country back, and corruption is a very, very, very big problem.
Yeah.
And institutional, the fraying of the institutions of the country. Yeah. Now, the vital interest for me, I think I did mention a number of them here, because I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to talk about, but I'll be very, very brief because we don't have much time. I think some of the issues that really concern me constitute the core vital interests of South Africa. Our role on the continent, especially in terms of providing leadership on regional integration process, whether it's SADC, whether it's SACU. I think we have not done very well there. And I think that I've also mentioned the other issue about this north-south dichotomy, which really clouds our ability to identify our specific interests because we pursue foreign policy on the basis of ideological impulses instead of that's another issue. I've mentioned the issue of migration because South Africa is a big magnet on the continent. It's a big magnet, and we can harness that to our benefit. If we have a strategic approach to migration, we can focus on attracting skills in order to position this economy for greater global competitiveness, while also reducing the inflow of illegal refugees and migrants. I'm not saying we should not. We're part of the international system and we have laws and the protocols to which we subscribe. We have to perform our international obligations in terms of illegal migrants and refugees. But I think in our case, my concern is that we don't have a very clear policy there. So I would mention those as some of our key, strategic, vital interests. Protecting our borders is a big problem. Every country in the world, single most important core vital interest is the protection of its citizens, right? Protecting the state and the citizens, and that means having secure borders. Making sure that you deal with organized crime, you deal with all those issues. But based on our experience, I don't think that is something we prioritize. In this country, we've done well. We had that national explosion in July, right?
Yes.
Which is a core vital interest of any state. Is going to protect its citizens. It went on for days without us knowing what was happening, without the so-called protests of the disorder were not identified, and to this day we don't know, right?
We still don't have those 12 people.
And then you have the economic infrastructure, the N3, the Durban port, which is so vital, not only to South Africa, it's extremely vital. Landlocked countries like Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana also depended on it, right? And that was unoperational for days without us knowing what is being done to deal with this. Other economic infrastructure was also sabotaged. So those are the vital, this is what you're talking about when you talk about vital interests. Right?
Yes, yes.
Foreign policy
No,
needs to further those domestic socio-economic objectives. That is what it should do.
In fact, in a way, you're saying all political activity, whether foreign or domestic, is ultimately domestic, because it's got to serve and advance, protect and advance, protect, preserve and advance the interests of the South African people. And that's what you're saying. And in essence, that is what should inform how we shape and evolve our place in the world, basically. That should be our North Star. Now, Prof, we a little bit over time. I want to say to everybody who's listening, I've really enjoyed this chat as much as I have enjoyed the book itself. It's a significant volume of work, so please go and get it. South Africa and the World, a political economy journey through time. And I must tell you, you will particularly enjoy the insights, the essays that the Prof has written over the years, because you read them with today's lens. And I think, how did you know that at the time? How did you see that? So, Prof, I want to thank you. I really want to thank you for this volume. It's a huge contribution to our intellectual and policy body of work. And it provokes a very vital conversation that we as South Africans, not just in academia, we really should have about how to move our country forward and how to take our place in the world. So thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you very much, Songezo. And thank you for sharing so well. Appreciate it. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks to everyone. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so
All
much.
right. Thank you very much.
Prof.
Thank you.
Fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. Let's go buy the book. Yes. Thank you so much. We're ending the session now.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Bye all.